to survive. The glow that the sun gets right around sunset helps me realize that this is just a journey. Drop your worries, you are gonna turn out fine. Oh, you turn out fine. Fine, oh, you turn out fine. But you gotta keep your head up, oh, and you can let your head down, hey. You gotta keep your head up, oh, and you can let your head down, hey. I know it's hard, to remember sometimes, but you gotta keep your head up, oh, and you can let your head down, hey, 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 hey. I got my hands in my pockets, kicking these rocks. It's kinda hard to watch this life go by. I'm buying into skeptics, skeptics mess with the confidence in my eyes. I'm seeing all the angles, thoughts get tangled. I start to compromise my life and my purpose. Is it all worth it? Am I gonna turn out fine? Oh, you turn out fine. Fine, oh, you turn out fine. But you gotta keep your head up, oh, and you can let your head down, hey. You gotta keep your head up, oh, and you can let your head down, hey. I know it's hard, to remember sometimes, but you gotta keep your head up, oh, and you can let your head down, hey, hey, hey. Only rainbows after rain, the sun will always come again, and it's a circle, circling around again. It comes around again. I say only rainbows after rain, the sun will always come again, and it's a circle, circling around again. It comes around, but you gotta keep your head up, oh, and you can let your head down, hey. You gotta keep your head up, oh, and you can let your head down, hey. I know it's hard, to remember sometimes, but you gotta keep your head up, oh, and you can let your head down, hey. And keep your head up, and you can let your head down, and keep your head up, and you can let your head down, and keep your head up, and you can let your head down. Listen,
Hello, everyone. Welcome and good whatever moment of the day you are enjoying on your time zones. It's always so good to say welcome through my screen from Basel in Switzerland. It's a wonderful late afternoon here. Absolutely perfect context to talk about building and sustaining trust. This is a conversation part of our Hacking HR April series. And in case you will enjoy this and you want to look at it again and again and again, you will find the recording as well as the recordings of all our previous March series and April series on hackinghrlab.io. For the next hour, I will be your host. And as usual, our wonderful Jessa is backstage, keeping us honest and smooth on all things technical and logistics. Thank you, Jessa. Please make sure you drop a thank you for all her wonderful work. And the next hour will be very, very short. So I will ask Jessa to help me make the most of it and bring our speakers on the screen. And while they pop up, I will welcome those of you who have just joined over the last few seconds. And please make full use of the comments and the chat, and do consider this conversation space as much yours as it is our speakers. Answer to the questions. And we are particularly interested, one, just to see where you happen to listen to us or watch us. So just drop us a quick heads up on where you are on this wonderful planet. And also what we've learned over and over and over again is that these topics, they have such wonderful nuances across cultures and generations and so many intersectionalities. And we are always super curious to see how you experience the topic in your own environment and within your own context. So I will wrap up my introduction blabathon here and just kick it off. You are all veterans by now of our panel, so you know the drill. I will pass the e-mic around for this first round of introductions as you appear on my screen. So Mary, that means that you will go first in just a few seconds. Short introductions, and then could you just please share with us, when you hear the word trust, what comes first in your mind? And it can be another word or a short story or anything that these words prompt. So Mary, welcome. So good to see you.
Hi. Good. What did you say? Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you all may be. My name is Mary Finch, and I come to you from Chicago. And when you ask a question, when I hear the word trust, what comes to mind? What comes to mind is transparency.
Thank you. Dave, welcome. Good to see you. It's been a hot minute since we shared a conversation.
No, always a pleasure to get to spend a little bit of time with you, Manola. Dave Scott, lead the HR team here at Dish Network, a satellite pay TV provider and cellular wireless company. Joining you from Denver, Colorado. So, and when I think of trust, I certainly think of the idea of doing what you say and saying what you do in a consistent way.
Thank you so much. Lori, welcome. Good to see you.
Thank you. Great to be here. And welcome all colleagues on the panel and attendees of today's session. I am speaking to you from a little place in Canada called the city of Mississauga, which is part of the Greater Toronto Area. And when I think of trust, I think of respect, results, and energy.
Thank you. Burjette, happy to see you. Welcome.
Good to see you, Manola. My name is Burjette White. I lead HR for Adecco, a temporary staffing and workforce solutions group in North America. And I come to you guys today from Atlanta, Georgia, from my home. When I think of trust, I think of what does that mean in lieu of that word, and how do people experience it? I think it's experienced through a level of authenticity and understanding and assurance. Assurance, not that everything is all right all the time, but more so assurance that what I'm hearing and what I'm experiencing is real.
Thank you. And Alex, so happy to see you. I know you soldiered through some technical issues. Welcome.
Thank you. Always technical difficulties, right? But glad I'm here. So Alex Prasis, I'm in Chicago as well. And my most recent role was leading global DEI for a Workday partner. My previous experience is around organizational development, employee engagement, employee experience. And related to this especially, I'm also pursuing my PhD in organizational leadership. My focus is actually on trust in the workplace. That is the outcome I'm looking at, and I'm kind of putting together the factors that contribute to that. So it's interesting. I've been so deep in the research. When I think of trust, I actually think of kind of more of the research definition. The willingness to be vulnerable with another person. So that's what I think of when I think of trust.
Thank you all so very much for taking the time and the energy to be here today. And as I was thinking about our panel, and as I was quieting my mind to come into the conversation, a question popped up. And I would really invite you to take a few minutes and speak about in what ways, if any, really, trust in workplace is different than trust in our everyday life and in our everyday interactions. And what I will do as we will ease into our conversation dynamics, I will just leave the e-mic and then I declare the unmuting competition officially open. Please grab it. And I do have to give you a fair heads up. This is something we've seen over and over again. It's tough to go last. So how is trust in workplace different, if in any way, from trust in our everyday life?
I came off of mute. It's actually hard to go first too, because then everybody else follows. I think that, for me, if you show up authentically, there won't be a difference between how you show up at work versus, or trust, or how you build trust in a workplace versus how you build trust or what that represents outside of the workplace. The reason why I just captured trust under the word transparency is because when people can see you, and I mean, not just like hear you in your interactions, they're able to determine how they can have a relationship with you. And again, I think it was Dave that made the comment that said, it's not just what you say, but it's also how you show up. So, people are looking at you and how your behavior is to determine if they trust you. And sometimes it's not dependent on what you have to say. So for me, if you show up authentically, it doesn't make a difference if it's personally or professionally.
I would agree with that, Mary. I'd also just add that I think the expectations around trust might be different. And in that space, thinking for employees, for example, their expectations around trust are that they're contracting with the organization to work there. Expectations that the organization and their leaders are going to be transparent, are going to be honest, and they're trusting that to be true. And so, but it's a choice then in working in that space. In home or personal life, I think that you tend to give more grace because that might be your family relationships. And so when the trust is broken, you're more prone to say, how can I resolve or repair this? Whereas if it is a workplace relationship, you might have a little less patience or less expectation to maintain that in contracting beyond the experience.
I would also build on what Mary started us with, and that is, I don't think that if you're demonstrating true, authentic leadership, I don't think you can separate the two, because I think one of the keys to building trust is consistency. And so when you're not demonstrating that behavior, whether you're in the workplace or outside of the workplace, if you're trying to separate the two, I don't think it's workable for people.
Dave, I saw you unmuting yourself earlier.
No, I couldn't agree more with the perspective that have been shared, but I think this idea of kind of repeatable experiences that build trust in a family or in a community environment where people know you in a broad set of all of what you represent, in the slice of which in a large organization as a leader, some may only know you from a distance. I think that trust is much easier to violate in almost in an accidental way, because you may not know the perspectives that everyone that's viewing you from a distance are bringing to that discussion in the way that in a more intimate relationship you would have established. And so I think there is some complexity in the business world because of the kind of single dimension that individuals have with you in that moment.
Thank you, Dave.
I was just going to say, building off of that, one thing that parallels, I was thinking about how, you might be this great leader who shows up as your authentic self, but some people have a disposition to trust a little more easily. Some people do not, right? And just like any relationship, we come in with our own baggage in that relationship. We come to that with kind of thinking about our past experiences and not realizing that, as a leader, if we might say something that makes people feel they can't trust us, not realizing that kind of speaks to a past experience of theirs. So that was one thing that came to mind. The other thing I thought about was, so I do a lot of DISC coaching, and one of the things in my assessment is we actually compare your natural style to your adaptive style or your work style, right? And if there is a large difference between those, it's often due to a lack of trust in your environment. There's so many things that kind of feed into that. But sometimes too, so I score extremely high on D&I and almost nothing on S&C. So I have to kind of mute my personality a little bit in the workplace. Otherwise, I will just be way too intense for everybody. So I think there's a little bit of everything you can take away when it comes to kind of comparing the personal and the professional relationships. But I think what Mary said is always great advice. And the more you can get to know people, like Dave said, right? Like you're only getting a snippet, you know, it's hard to build that trust, but when you do have those moments with people one-on-one, taking advantage of those, and really kind of backing up what you're saying with actions. Those are the best things you can do, both personally and professionally.
Listening to your conversation, I picked up on something, and I just want to keep all of us mindful on something, whether we talk about D&I or mental health or psychological safety or trust in the workplace. We tend to highlight how leaders and or managers are responsible or accountable to ensure that. So I was really wondering if we can expand that conversation. How can anyone build that trust environment around them, regardless of where they are on the hierarchy or regardless of their own perception of leadership? And if you can just share a few of your thoughts, especially I'm thinking as I'm going, especially you also mentioned one-to-one interactions, and the workplace is such a community. So how can work be organizational trust and not just one-to-one individual interactions?
I would say as employees, right, one of the first things that comes to mind, and part of this is building it into the organizational culture, is giving feedback directly. I have been in that position where 10 people knew about the feedback before I did, and it doesn't feel good, right? So, you know, building up your own feedback skills, you know, building into practice, asking for feedback and being receptive to the feedback. We all have to own how we react to the feedback as well to build trust between each other. You know, and obviously there's, you know, I'm caveating that there's certain feedback maybe that isn't fair, but I'm just saying for the most part, right, if we're just talking about constructive feedback going to each other directly. So I think that's kind of one thing that immediately came to mind when it comes to building trust between employees.
Burjette, you're unmuted. Would you like to build on that?
Yes, I was thinking a little bit about what Alex was sharing, and with trust in the workplace, I do believe that we start to think a little bit from the leader or manager view, in the sense of culture. Employees experience an organization through their direct teams for the most part. You can have an organizational tenet and vision and goals, as well as trust as a value. But what you experience in your direct team is how will shape that employee's experience in the organization. So we tend to gravitate towards supporting managers and building that organizational culture or remnants of trust. But I think for employees, the role that they have is exactly as described, is showing up, being cognizant of what type of team or what culture they want to create, what microculture, and letting trust being a tenet of that. But it does start a bit of top down and bottom up at the same time in order for it to really gel and be effective.
Lori.
Yeah, I think again, I go back to you know, I always default to the leader as well. Like I'm listening and I'm reflecting, and I do actually. It's the first place I go. But you know, the truth is, you know, the trust is built as an individual, regardless of what level you're in within the organization, and it does go back to that showing up consistently. And I like the concepts that were discussed around, you know, providing a safe space, essentially, where people can actually provide feedback and receive it in a way that advances the work and the interests of everyone. I think they're really important, and I do believe that individuals identify with those closest around them. And I think on the larger issue of trust, it's a series of very small micro actions that actually help to build that organizational trust on behalf of everyone over time. So that would be my thinking.
Thank you. Dave, I saw you unmuted a few seconds ago.
Yeah, no, I think the team has hit on so many points in this idea that how you deliver consistently in both your behavior and in quite frankly your results, right, can drive an individual showing how they trust. But so much of it is also in our world, how you engage, right? How are you making eye contact? Are you approaching and leaning into a discussion versus leaning back? I spent many years in retail, and I could walk into a store and within moments understand the relationship that the team was having with the store manager and how she or he interacted, but also by whether the team members came to you and were excited about their work and showed you what they were doing, or did they scatter and run in a different direction when leadership was in the building because of the negative environment that existed in that space. And so as with the complexity of oftentimes these video calls, the nonverbal interactions build trust in a much bigger way sometimes than the verbal interactions that come through.
Now you experience the other end of the spectrum, Mary. You went first and now you go last.
I was going to say, here I am last. Everybody hit a really good points, but as I started to think about when we talk about culture, an organization or agency or company is just exactly what it is. It's a building and whatever you put into it, but the people are the culture, right? So one of the things that I put in this post when I was reposting for this particular panel, I mentioned to build people who build agencies. So from the top, if there's if we thought about how we build brands or how we market to agencies and the components that we put into to making sure if we're doing a pitch, and I've worked for many different agencies, even though I'm the head of people for a global company now, but I worked for many different agencies. And I think about what goes into an actual pitch when you're going for business or you're trying to seek business to have them, as part of your portfolio. If we use that same method of what components do we need to build our people, then it's still starting from the top. And, for me, employees will be able to see, like, if things aren't tolerated from the top, then these are the behaviors that they need to follow. Or again, because our people are a culture, if they don't fit into that model, then they don't really fit into that company, right? So even when we talk about feedback, I always think about feedback or reviews as something that we talk about employees, but it almost feels like it's an absence of leaders. Like employees get performance reviews, but leaders, as long as they're making whatever they need to make to maintain the business, they're almost kind of exempt from it. But if they were getting that same type of feedback and everybody knew, now you're creating your culture that's really 360. So that's the feedback that I have in regards to trust and building people.
Well, all of you, Mary, I think you were the first one to, speak about transparency. I saw transparency popping up quite a lot in the comments as well. So here's a question, somewhat bringing us probably more into the leadership dimension and quite potentially into the HR as a function. How can you build and maintain trust when you have transparency considerations and transparency constraints to observe?
I'll start us off on this one. So, this is where I think when you talk about distinctions in the workplace and, in community, what the differences are around trust, I think This is where we may have some experience a little more limitation in some circumstances where we're unable to actually provide, full details. But I think what's really important is to be transparent about that and to say, I can't share all those details with you. And the more context you can provide to do that, I think helps to build that trust. People may still be anxious that you're not being fully transparent about something, but I think you lay the groundwork when you set that parameter.
I would just add on to that. So it's really about setting expectations, right? Like, just like a leader would with anything else, setting expectations of what they can and cannot share. But one of the first things that came to mind was just treat people like adults. I think sometimes leaders err too far on feeling like they can't share anything or say anything, right? And it's completely okay to say, like, I don't know right now. We don't have an update. So to at least check in with people, and the average person does understand. They expect that you can't share everything. They just want to know that you are going to communicate when you do share something. So you can build up that trust to get to those points by having those forums for communication, whether it be town halls or, whatever works for your particular organization. But yeah, and I think it's setting expectations, and then also just, knowing that you can trust people more than you might think, with the caveat that obviously there always are limitations.
And if I could add to that, fully agree. And I think that there will be points in times where organizations simply cannot share. You would like to be able to, but you cannot. It's, in my mind, perfectly okay to say I cannot share. We're working through these pieces, but here's when I expect to be able to share more. I think that additional point allows some level of closure, at least understanding of when information will be shared. What also becomes important in that space is being consistent with that response. It becomes difficult and you erode trust if you share a little tidbit with one person or share a little bit with someone else and don't hold true to that, because people will talk and they'll compare notes and try to piece together a story that will be oftentimes much different than what you had intended, because you're not sharing the full picture but snippets. But then also it starts to erode trust because that person starts to wonder, well, why did I not have that detail? Why did they share with this person? And all the stories that you create in your head and in your mind. So important in that is if you're not in a space you're going to be fully transparent, explaining why, explaining when you expect to be able to, and then holding true to that conversation line with every conversation.
Anyone else would like to build on this? Dave?
Yeah, no, thank you. I think maybe an example, right, of a situation that as an organization we're going through right now that I think adds color to this. Recently, it had a fairly significant cybersecurity event going on in the organization, of which we've shared some information, but not all. And part of that was sharing that, there was some information that was taken out and away from the organization, right? And so I think that consistently coming back and letting the team know where we're at, what's going on in the activities and the investigations that we're under, that we're not in a position to share information at this time, but that we're actively working it, has given an ability for them to understand that when we do know, we will tell them. We're not avoiding the conversation. We're not silent. And I think silence is really the enemy of trust in these moments, because the conversation, the stories will fill that gap that the company isn't providing. And so there's a drumbeat of, when we can tell you something, we will, that helps the team regain a bit of that trust in these types of scenarios. And ultimately, you have to close that story, right? You can't leave them kind of unread for the rest of time. And the speed in which you're able to close that is also critically important in helping to both maintain and reestablish trust in situations such as we're going through.
Yeah, I can add just a little bit to it. Again, everything that everyone has said, you've pretty much touched on it. But I do agree, like, you know, even though you want to be transparent, there is this kind of common sense piece to it. And this common sense piece to it is that sometimes in not sharing everything is a bit of protection, because you don't want to cause chaos. You don't want things to get disruptive. But if there are some things that might have, just say, for instance, Dave, you raised a point, something exists where employees could talk about it. So that can manifest into chaos. So of course you want to get ahead, you know, and you want to make sure that people feel a little bit at ease and that you are protecting them, because that's where it leads to. It's about the protection of it. But going back to Manola, you asked the question about personally versus professionally. In both of those cases, sometimes you cannot share everything, right? And some things you just cannot touch on. And it's not that you're not being authentic. It's just that you're trying to protect. You're trying to protect the business. You're trying to protect the employees. In small situations that can be like eased over, I think it's okay either to mention it or to not say anything about it at all, just because you don't want that flag to raise where people are just like, well, what else did they not share? What else did I not know about this? So, you know, it's important to help with your narrative, but if we look at trust equaling protection, sometimes we do have to be quiet on some things.
Laurie, please, I saw you wanted to add something.
Yeah, I was listening to everyone, and it just occurred to me that this goes back to the point of establishing trust in your ongoing relationships. Because when it comes time to, you know, where you may not be able to disclose, you know, and be fully transparent with a situation, the fact that you've invested in that time and that trust building will ease in that conversation as well.
Well, I am very sorry to say that we're entering the second half of our conversation, but I have to give you heads up, a challenge is coming. Whether we talk about trust as prerequisite for connection or connection as prerequisite for trust, sooner rather than later, we go into, the hybrid environment. And if I had $1 for every single time I heard the question of what are the biggest challenges in building trust in a hybrid environment, I would probably be now reading on an island with no Wi-Fi. And I don't want to make the next facilitator rich, so I will ask you with a twist. What are the biggest opportunities for building trust in a hybrid environment? And I will give you a few seconds to think about it, just to say welcome to everybody who joined us a little bit later. It's always good to have you. And for those of you who have to leave us a little bit earlier than upon the hour, do go back and watch the recording. I'm sure that we're in for an amazing second half of our conversation. So, biggest opportunities to build trust in hybrid environment. And Dave, I saw you unmuting yourself.
Yeah, no, I think because I'll take the easiest answer on this one, but there certainly is a challenge, I think, for leaders or for corporations to actually believe that in a hybrid or remote environment that work is being done at a level that is consistent with those that may do it on site or when being more directly supervised. And so I think the start in a hybrid environment is by developing your policies with the expectations that your team is doing their job and they're doing it really well. And they're producing for the organization by balancing all of the other complexities that are going on in their life. And so I think extending grace and belief that work is being accomplished begins that discussion of establishing trust in these critical environments. And the moment that you violate that by monitoring software events or by counting clicks or by containing a dashboard of the number of, Google Meets that someone was on. You're establishing an environment that starts with a lack of trust in your team members.
It's interesting. I was actually thinking about this very differently. That example hadn't come to mind, even though that's probably the most kind of talked about example, right? So what I was thinking about was, in a remote environment, so, whether it's hybrid or remote, somewhere where you're not in the office together, right? I observed that there was a lack of accountability to each other. And I think it's because, if you're in an office, there's only so long you can avoid the conflict, right? If you're in the same office together, you're going to have to hash it out. You're going to have to talk through it. There is that greater accountability to, form a stronger relationship when you're both in the same physical location. But then you have, when you are remote or when one person's in the office, one person's not, you have distance bias come into play, right? Where, you feel like, well, I don't really need to deal with that. I can just shut my computer. I don't have to kind of work through that conflict. How nice is that, right? Because I don't really like dealing with conflict anyway. So how do you breed accountability around that and give people the tools to work through conflict, no matter whether you're in the office or not, and feel that accountability to each other? I think that's really important. And I think, I mentioned earlier, right, like providing each other feedback directly, like having the commitment to work through, issues with each other, making sure you're rallying around that mutual goal that you're all going for can help build and kind of mitigate that distance bias.
I could just add, so there's not one trick pony on this because all organizations aren't built the same. And what might work for one company, depending on what they're producing, might be a better fit for someone to be in an office versus for someone to be at home. Dave had mentioned a point in regards to like clicks and monitoring, like Big Brother monitoring what we're doing. But I feel like if you have been managing your team when you were in office, you're going to do that same managing of your team when you're on Zoom. So really it equates to the results. If you're not producing, you'll know that the manager will know that right away if they are accountable to making sure that they are catching up with their team, keeping their team on track, keeping their projects on track. Like that's kind of it's pretty quick to see. But going back to the trust piece is that if that person wasn't really producing when they were in the office, I don't really feel like much of that is going to change when they were on Zoom. They weren't producing when they were in the office, but now you notice because you're far away. So, it just helps to kind of the consistency, the conversation, making sure that you are connecting with people, that is setting up meetings, those types of things. If you are doing those things, I feel like it equals the results. You don't have to worry about whether you are in person or if you're on a Zoom call, etc. The results speak for themselves.
Mary, I agree with that. And I think sometimes with virtual work, whether you were hired virtual and have never met your manager in person, or you went from office to remote based, the dynamics might be different. So if you have not yet engaged with your employee in person, or if your employees have not engaged with each other, you're almost starting from a space of skepticism because you have not built that relationship. And so there becomes moments of truth or moments of clarity in that relationship that hopefully reinforce trust or could start to erode it. And results driven is an important piece of that, but also how do you celebrate your wins? How do you collaborate and create opportunities to do that effectively in a hybrid way? But also how do you coach or provide feedback when things don't go well? The added complexity to that might also be if you have some mix of team members who are in person and others remote. How do you manage that hybrid of a team such that everyone has a level of shared collaboration, shared partnership, and trust building, where some might be easier to do that because of the in-person interactions. So it's challenging. I think the onus is on not only the team members as they think of how they want to show up and engage in a team environment, because it is more challenging in a hybrid way, but also to the manager and helping to establish and create a culture of trust and partnership within that group.
I was wondering, as we look at the economic realities around us, and increased talk about productivity and cost management, and the sad reality of layoffs around us, there seems to be increasing energy and increasing focus on anything business case driven and metrics. So I was wondering, how can trust be measured or evaluated in such a way that, this is why it's worth putting in the effort?
Well, I'm going to start us off with a very non-scientific answer. And that actually just is reflecting on something that Dave said earlier. Having worked in a retail environment myself in the past, I too experienced similar, experiences where you would walk into a store and know right away, just instinctively in terms of behaviors that are demonstrated. So, without attaching any kind of metric to it or, sort of valid measurement, what I would say is that there are signs instinctively, I think, around lack of communication, perhaps missed, conflicting understanding on a particular topic or an issue, to demonstrate that people are not connecting and trusting. And transparency, again, transparency not being demonstrated. I think those are the non-scientific evaluation methods that I'm going to add to the conversation.
I always like to think about, how do people disagree as an indicator of trust? Do they disagree within the team? Is it the nods around the table? Is there the space for constructive conflict or sharing of differences of an opinion in a way that is productive, such that there's not the water cooler conversation? That all, to me, is an indicator of trust within a team, but also within that organization. So, Lori, as you're saying, it's about what's said, but also in observing team dynamics will help you to see what is the level of trust within that group.
I love what you said, Bourget. And last week we had a conversation on positive work environments. And very early on in the conversation, it came up that a positive work environment is not an environment, with no tension, but it's an environment with a very constructive approach to conflict and tension. So I will consider this +1. Alex, I saw you unmuted.
Yeah, and actually what you're both speaking to, Brigitte, really speaking to directly, is psychological safety, right? If you're looking for kind of the exact questions to ask, in a survey, Amy Edmonds' book, The Fearless Organization, actually has the questions that can be used to assess psychological safety in the organization. And when we're talking about psychological safety, we're talking about that references the team and organizational level. Trust is interpersonal, right? Trust is one-to-one. There are also, research-backed questions that relate to trust. Happy to share those with anyone if you want to know. Like I said, I've been doing a lot of looking into this. But I think you hit them spot on, right? And it's about so much more than metrics. How do you feel, day to day? It's about, if you want to dive into it, the survey is only going to tell you so much, because if people don't trust, they're not going to complete the survey, or they're not going to be truthful in the survey, right? So that the survey is not helpful either. So it's, you could do focus groups. You could also look at, measuring success of meetings, right? So what Brigitte was speaking to was kind of looking at, how are meetings set up? Are they set up in an inclusive way? What is feedback from the meetings that are happening? What is it looking like for your innovation? Looking at, any kind of metrics, KPIs related to innovation. If that's lacking, you might want to check for psychological safety, right? That may be something that's hindering.
I do think you can often measure trust by individuals' behaviors, right? And Alex, I think you were just talking about this in terms of psychological safety. As we were preparing here in Colorado on implementing pay transparency laws back in 2021, right? It really came down to a conversation around, what can people trust organizational behaviors, and we saw some things that, like, applications into our roles increased significantly when we posted a proper pay range in for a job. Like 68%, I think, of applicants today won't apply for a job if the pay range isn't posted, simply because they want to trust that the organization is going to reward them appropriately in the role, right? And I read another stat recently about 81% of individuals will stay with an organization if they feel like they're paid equitably for their role and responsibility. And again, that's an element of organizational trust, and it's also in the individual trusting that the organization is doing the right things. And so it's interesting to think about, we always want to fall back to retention or attrition or applicant flow or hiring offer accepts, right, in HR, because they're quantifiable metrics that we plan to. And I think almost every one of those quantifiable metrics fall back into fundamentally a question around trust. And is the company displaying trust behaviors, and right? You can even look at theft as an element of trust in an organization.
It is definitely hard to go last. So, because you all have touched on all those things, I will say internally with the organization, one way to measure, not necessarily by metrics, but just like instinctively, like Lori said, is when you are in the office and kind of seeing the vibe, the temperature of how people are communicating with each other, avoiding each other, the voices in the room, who's not necessarily the loudest voice, but who gets time at the table to be able to communicate. That's also a way of kind of measuring that. Another way I will say from an HR perspective is just, I've done it in the past, people partnering. So just having regular catch-ups with employees where you don't wait for them to come to you, but you go to them just to do regular check-ins to see how things are going. A way to measure is performance reviews, of course. That is a time where salary is on the table of conversations, behavior. So all of those things are being touched during the review, and that is a way of measuring. Now, I wouldn't just leave it necessarily with the manager, but also kind of seeing what those reviews are when you do, I forgot what we call them. I've been out for a little bit because I recently had a little one. So I'm just now getting back to work after parental leave. But just having those touch points with your managers to see where your hypos are at, or where if there's some issues within employees, that gives you a little bit of metrics to find out how teams are operating. And then the last piece, which you obviously don't want to use that, but if you need to, you can, is the retention piece. Employees tend to tell you everything that they wanted to tell you, what they will tell you, what they should have told you as they are exiting out. So that is a way of also kind of measuring. But of course, the objective is to retain employees and having those different things in place where you're having conversations, you're having a consistency, you're having a transparency. I think that helps build the trust in the conversations with employees to retain them.
Well, thank you, Mary, for trusting us with the great news. Very happy to hear that. And the title of our panel is Building and Sustaining Trust. And as I was listening to this conversation, I was wondering, under what circumstances can we add restoring trust in this conversation? Throughout your answers, you touched on how we gain it and also how we lose it. How can we restore it?
A perfect example would be after a layoff, right? What are those next actions? What are you doing to protect the people that are there? There's a lot of kind of, it's similar to survivor skills, right? Where, the people that are there have a lot of feelings involved too. They may have been super close with the people that were there, and they have, emotions attached to people leaving. So it's an especially vulnerable time for the organization as far as losing trust. So I think it is how you handle that. Do you handle it with compassion? Do you take the time instead of just saying, okay, back to business, everything's normal, get on with it, at least you got to keep your job, really handling it with compassion is kind of the only word I can think of, but, making sure you're having conversations, you're leaving room and space for those conversations. And that's at every level, right? I think that is a really important way to regain that trust or restore that trust.
What's the saying, right? Trust takes years to build, seconds to break, and forever to recover. I do think there's a lot of truth in that. And I think in moments where I've made mistakes and violated trust, whether collectively or individually, I think the starting point is a sincere acknowledgement and an apology, right? And burying it, not responding to it, not reacting to the emotion or the feedback that you're receiving, right, just makes that path even further. The journey definitely begins with an acknowledgement and a recognition and owning the fault in that moment.
I would say, given that, because the question is built on how do you restore trust? So hopefully trust had already been established that when something does happen, that person feels comfortable enough to mention what happened to them in that place, right? And then to Dave's point, when you acknowledge what has happened, not being defensive, but understanding where that person is coming from, and just kind of talking those things through. Alex, you mentioned, what is that when you do like a layoff? So with layoffs, I do agree, like how you handle those situations, how you support the employees that are being laid off, and then how you are communicating to employees that are there. Because there's no real protection, but there is a conversation that can happen to acknowledge what had taken place. The employees that had left, giving them their roses, their kudos, so what they have been able to do, because employees, that's recognition. And I feel like that builds morale within employees as well. So I think those are ways to restore. When something has happened, acknowledge it, try to get in front of it. But hopefully if the trust has already been built, you'll know about it and you won't hear from 5 different people before it gets to you. Hopefully you'll hear from it directly.
You've all said a lot, so I won't add too much more other than to emphasize that layoffs in the space that we are in economically, layoffs are one of those additional moments of truth for employees. And not only how are you treating the team members that are leaving with grace, with empathy, with care and respect, giving them their roses and all of those things, because it's not easy for anybody. But treating them well is important for them, for how you want to be seen as an organization, but also for who's watching are those employees that are staying. They're watching to see how are their peers being treated on their way out and thinking, wow, will that be me one day? Or you know what? I don't want that to be me. I don't like this whole experience. I don't like observing it. I don't want to be caught in that space. So there's a lot of benefit to doing that well, most importantly for the persons that are leaving, but also for the organization that you want to retain, who have a choice to make for themselves as well.
Sorry.
Yeah, I'm going to go back to the concept of authenticity and just really sort of honing in on the point about when when trust is broken and it needs to be restored, thinking from the place of those who are impacted and not from a defensive, how can we, fix this kind of place, right? It's really thinking about those who are impacted and not necessarily, how do I make this situation that either I or the organization has created, occur in the first place. So I think that's key.
I do have a piece of news, and you will be the judges whether this is good or sad. We are about 8 minutes away from saying goodbye. And you made me curious about something. If you imagine that you could go back in time to your younger selves before your first work experience, and with everything that you have learned about building, sustaining, and restoring trust across your career, what would be your advice?
I don't know even where to start with that one. That is such a heavy question, but let me just say this. So when I even got into HR, it was because of me seeing how my leader was. This was years ago, so no one would even know. But I was able to see how my leader was in his or her role, and in that role, I knew that when it was my time, that I would do it differently. I used that person as kind of an example of being the type of leader that I wanted, I should say. So I wouldn't say there's anything that I would tell myself. Lessons learned years ago. I did learn that do not allow people to put you into situations that you have to account for. So that was a lesson learned for me, to make sure that I'm being empathetic, that I'm not quick to respond, but I'm giving thought into what I'm saying. So I'm being a thoughtful leader. And of course, you don't have to be a leader by title. Everyone leads in some way and has that quality to do it. So whatever platform that I'm in, if I'm in my professional, if I'm in my personal, I just make sure that I'm hearing what the person is saying and try to take from that. And as I'm talking now, I am thinking about this. So the other part is asking people when they have things that they want to talk about, what do they want from me? Because naturally, I like to go solve issues. And sometimes people are not looking for the solve, they're looking for the listen. So just asking permission from people of what they want. And that goes back to being thoughtful of others and being empathetic. So.
Yeah, I'd love to build off that a little bit. One of the things that came to mind for me was external self-awareness. And, I mentioned earlier, I'm a strong DI personality, right? And because I'm so direct, I assume that people who aren't direct were deceptive, or, like there was something kind of like missing with them, right? Like there couldn't be anything wrong with me. Everyone should just be direct and to the point, right? But I had to learn, and DISC was super helpful for that. I had to learn how to adjust my communication style and create that environment for trust. And not just when we're talking about a power dynamic where I might be the manager, but also I've had managers who were S's, who were terrified to manage me, right? Like, like when I was much younger. So even just thinking from all sides has been so helpful for me. I know with trust. So that was kind of the big thing that came to mind for me, is really having that strong external self-awareness, understanding how I'm coming across and what I can do to make the situation better.
Alex, it's funny that you said that, because I had a conversation more recently with my college-age daughter who's starting to dabble into the workforce, and she always comes to me and asks me some questions. So she said, what do I do? How do I show up? I said, well, give some thought, write down how you want to show up. How do you want people to experience you? Think about those adjectives and then reflect on that, not to become someone else, but to think about how those adjectives are showing up in your behaviors, and you can build trust and build those experiences, because each interaction is an experience. And if you want people to leave with a certain experience with you, start to build that up, but also know that you won't always get it right. And when you don't get it right, we all mess up sometimes. Owning it, acknowledging it, and thinking about how do you make it better. And that's just for any employee, myself included. I think about that all the time, because it's important for people to know that you're showing up as yourself and being honest and transparent, but you also have control in how you do engage externally, Alex.
I think for me, it's really just about staying true to, my value of integrity. And I've had to make some tough decisions and have tough conversations along the way. And as long as I can connect them back to my personal values, I'm okay with that.
Because the only thing I may add is that trust is certainly a skill, like the other skills that we've all developed over time. And both being able to receive trust and extend trust can be learned, right? And whether that's on a sports team or participating in a play or playing an instrument in a band or an orchestra, you learn to rely on someone doing what you expect them to do in that moment, and they rely on you to do what you're expected to do in those moments. And so there are so many different ways to establish and gain trust and practice those skills so that people know that when it's your note, you'll hit the note that is required. And when your teammate, needs to hit that note, they'll do it as well. And so I would go back and encourage myself to see, how do you put yourself in positions that maybe you didn't have a chance to learn in your family or as a child or in other social situations, that trust is important and what it feels like to be trusted.
I love these bits. And a few years back, I learned through an unexpected challenge to build to-be list, not just to-do list. So if I could go back to my younger self, I would tell myself, before you build your to-do list, what is your to-be list? And that is part of my intentional, back to self-awareness, Alex, both my self-awareness work and the work that I do with other teams. So a big thank you, Mary, Dave, Lori, Alex, and Burjette for being here today. A big thank you to everybody who was here and took the time and curiosity to spend this hour with us. Always such a pleasure. I hope I will get the joy to welcome you again tomorrow. We will be talking about burnout and a total well-being culture. And until then, I will see you around. I hope we will cross paths on hackinghrlab.io and build, sustain, and restore trust. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your week. Bye.